back to another episode of History Now. With seemingly the world's eyes upon Putin and Russia, I think that it's probably a very apt time to look at a bit of Russian history. So on today's show, I'm joined by Dr Alexander Titov from Queen's University Belfast, who's going to talk about the Russian Revolution, Stalin, and the continuing influence of Stalin's figure in contemporary Russia. Alex, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. And the topic we're talking about today, I think it has some relevance to world events that are happening at the minute. But to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about one of the leaders of Soviet Russia, probably the most famous, and that is Joseph Stalin. So could you give us a bit of background on Stalin, his early life and how he rose to prominence in Soviet Russia?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question. And Stalin, in many ways, was an unusual leader for the Soviet Union, not least because he wasn't actually Russian himself, right? So he originally came from non-Russian part of former Russian Empire, Georgia. The first language was not Russian, so he had to learn it around the age of 10. And he also came from relatively poor background, so his parents were peasants. His father was a shoemaker and who left them, and he was brought up by his mother. His path to power, to prominence, was actually quite typical of the Russian Empire in this time. So he was first generation of former peasants and poor people who went to equivalent of a grammar school. Then he went to higher level religious education, right, which for 4 years, so 6 years in the grammar school, 4 years in a seminary. And Russia and Georgia have the same religion, Orthodox religion, with some variants, but basically that's kind of broadly the same religion. That's that point that he became interested in revolutionary ideas, joined one of the many revolutionary parties which existed in Russia underground, so they were illegal organizations, right? So he lost his place in the seminary and became so-called professional revolutionary, right? So from very early age, so I think he's joined the what was then would later become known as Communist Party in around 1899, right? So he was born in 1874, so a very young age he joined the party, and he rose to prominence through that before the Bolsheviks achieved power. So he was very already prominent person within the party even before they came to power. I think that's very important, right? So that he was pre-revolutionary pedigree. That's very important for distinction between Bolsheviks. Khrushchev, for example, only joined them in 1818 when they already were in power, right? So that's kind of a different type. And that's he wasn't a leading Bolshevik member by no means, even at the war, but he certainly was one of the kind of top upper hierarchy of the party. He knew Lenin very well. They worked together. He went to exile several times, so he was arrested by the Tsarist authorities. He spent several years in very far away exile, where you were completely cut off from the world, where they sent kind of most dangerous revolutionaries. So he had kind of this life, and then when the revolution happened and the Bolsheviks came to power, he was one of the persons already by his nature of his revolutionary experience as kind of near the power. And then when Lenin his health began to wane, Stalin by that stage was one of the top 10 people within the party, if not top 5. And the rest of so Lenin died in 1924, January 1924. This period between Lenin's heavy illness in 23 to late 1920s, 29, is essentially a period of battle for power between different Bolshevik leaders, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev. Stalin was one of them. He was always trying to present himself as this person from the middle, a consensus politician, trying to kind of represent the majority view and so forth. So he dealt with the left opposition, Trotsky, Zinoviev, then with the right opposition, Bukharin and Rykov, his former allies. And once he got to power, when all the other ones were removed, essentially he began very radical policies, collectivization, industrialization, and also very radical policy of basically getting rid of all the former allies and people who were kind of higher in the party than even him was before he emerged as the sole leader. And that's already kind of a consolidation of power in the 1930s, where he's moving towards complete dominance as a kind of not a leader, but a full-on dictator, when he abolished any form of limits to his authority and his power through the Great Purges, in particular in 1937, 1938.
Correct me if I'm wrong, in the 1930s that's known as the Great Terror. Is there any sense of, can you tell us what that was felt like among ordinary people in the Russian Empire?
So it's a complex process. So we have essentially Stalin, once he kind of got to power, he began a series of very radical reforms, as I mentioned, collectivization, which was very painful process with more than 1 million peasants, those who were refusing to join the collective farms, being exiled. There was a large famine which killed many million people and so forth. And that was already beginning of the use of coercion and violence by the state, right? So 1920s were a period of relative calm, 30s were a period of intense violence, not always associated with purges. As I said, collectivization probably claimed many more lives than purges themselves. But to consolidate his political power, he did engage in purges, and I would imagine the beginning of the purges was the assassination of Sergei Kirov, Stalin's trusted lieutenant in Leningrad, which was always this as a opposition-minded city in Soviet Union. And Stalin used that. There is a big controversy whether Stalin was behind that murder or what had happened. But what I can say is that regardless of whether Stalin was behind it or not, there's no concrete evidence towards that effect. But he certainly used it to his own effect. That he launched a campaign of terror much more intense against internal opposition of the party. Right. So he accused Zinoviev and Kamenev and Trotsky of being behind that murder. And what it was, so he, as I think historian like Klivniuk makes this point, that instead of having inter-party disagreements where they lost an argument, they've been demoted, but they still remain communist, Stalin moved towards seeing them as enemies which had to be exterminated, right? So completely a different level of violence within the party. So if you have a look at the period between 1934, murder of Kirov, and 1937, when there was what we know as the Great Purge, this was all to do with cleansing the party, purging the party. This is beginning of the Moscow trials of the very famous Bolsheviks such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rykov, others, who basically Stalin eliminating any type of opposition within the party. Now, and then what we understand by Great Terror, 1937-38, becomes when this purges of the inner party and inner government spreads to population in general, right? And that's where you have a Great Terror, when they start basically try to purge anybody who is has any reason to be disgruntled with the Soviet Union, somebody who with the Soviet powers, anybody who can have be a problem if there is a war. So this is kind of context of the impending war with Germany, but also with Japan, very important in that respect. There is kind of justification of this Great Terror that we need to get rid of this fifth column, right? And I think listeners might know this fifth column was, of course, this comes from the Spanish Civil War, when General Mola, advancing on Madrid, he said we have 4 columns advancing on the capital, and then there is a 5th column inside it, right, which will help us. So this purging was also kind of portrayed as this getting rid of the purges of the all the unreliable elements in the Soviet society. But also what it did, of course, it also spread very much to the core of the Soviet regime itself. And Stalin eliminated any possible opposition to himself. So even his and I think that's very important to understand, is that even his closest allies, such as Molotov, Kaganovich, his brother, was arrested. Later, not in 1937, but later on, Molotov's wife was arrested, for example, right? So basically, the message was that Stalin, could get rid of anybody, however, whatever your hierarchy in the Soviet Union. So nobody could say anything against Stalin. He had absolute power, and the terror, the Great Terror, was key to him achieving that.
Post the Great Terror, when you move into, the Second World War period, certainly, among people who would consider on the Allied side, today, Britain and America, in the collective memory, Stalin and Russia's role in, fighting the Nazis isn't really addressed popularly. Can we talk a bit about that and how popular it was among people in Russia, involvement in the Second World War?
Well, I think the Second World War, as in Russia, it's known as the Great Patriotic War, because, of course, the Soviet Union entered the war 2 years later than the rest of Europe. And that was because of Stalin's policy of signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler, known as Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? So which postponed Soviet entry by up to 2 years. The Great Patriotic War is the single most important event in Russian history in the 20th century, in a century which is very rich for big events: Russian Revolution, Civil War, collectivization, and collapse of the Soviet Union. So the Great Patriotic War stands out in Russian popular memory, and that. So it's extremely important. It's one of the probably single event which has kind of national consensus because it's so important for Russia that Russia is defeated the Nazis. It's emerged as a superpower out of it, and because of that, of course, just going back to Stalin a little bit, is Stalin's role is become so controversial later on because he is closely associated with the Soviet victory too. And I think it's very important. There are many reasons why the Second War, the Great Patriotic War, is so remembered in Russia and still used in contemporary politics as one of the main reference points. Of course, very huge losses, human losses, so up to 26 million people. So that's the highest number of any combatant in the war. Okay, so we maybe have certainly in Europe, you need to look more carefully at China's data and so forth, but certainly the Soviet Union, proportion-wise, it was extremely high. Yeah. It completely changed the nature of the Soviet Union, kind of ethnic composition, its structure, and also gave a really kind of big point of reference for defining both the Soviet regime and also the Russian people themselves, right? This is the kind of main reference point about who they are, what they achieved in the 20th century. So it's extremely important in that respect.
Yeah, and we often hear, with reference to Stalin, people talk about the cult of personality. He was in power for a long time, died in the early 1950s. So after that, you have some sort of jockeying for position at the top of the food chain. But Khrushchev eventually succeeds him. It wasn't, a popular appointment with many people. Can we talk about that? Because what I've read of your work, people are talking about him betraying the revolution, etc. How much did Stalin's continuing presence and figure hang over the Khrushchev years?
I would say that Stalin, if you think about it, that really he created the Soviet Union, which then people came after him, such as Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, they were trying to reform, right? So Lenin just brought them to power, he consolidated it, but Stalin created the state in the sense of kind of planned economy, militarization, collectivization, get rid of the private property and so forth, dominance of the specific form of leadership in the Communist Party and so forth. Everybody was basically longing for changing of the system. But Stalin, after the Second World War, really did not, wanted to have any reforms. He just wanted to keep things going, which basically particularly meant very heavy reliance on security apparatus, on repression, and very kind of harsh conditions on extracting of all the resources from the population, particularly the peasantry. Right, so Russia was still a majority peasant country. So basically, everybody felt that reforms were needed. Once he died, then they felt liberated, and they began sort of to implement some form of reforms, which were already long overdue. Everybody felt about that. So that's kind of the context of the power struggle around post-Stalin, which is not kind of, you have these two periods of power, okay, maybe three periods of power. Post-Lenin, where you have collective leadership in the 1920s, and Stalin consolidated his power. 1950s was happening exactly the same thing, that Soviet Union lost its leader, and they moved to real collective leadership, not democracy, but there was no one single person who is kind of whatever he says goes, and so you have this prolonged power struggle between 1953 and 1957, really. And Khrushchev became the dominant person within this period. And one of the things, you mentioned cult of personality, that's kind of Khrushchev's invention. One of the kind of processes by which he tried to kind of undermine his opponents and put himself forward and make a distinct program was, of course, his attack on Stalin, which was done at February 1956, right? So we have at the end of the 20th Party Congress, the first Congress after the Stalin's death, Party Congress, where Khrushchev officials, it's known as the secret speech because it wasn't published, and it was done behind closed doors. But the official title is On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences, right? So that's the official title of Khrushchev's secret speech, in which he kind of outlined all the problems they had with Stalin, right? His divergence from Lenin, very important for Stalin, for Khrushchev to claim continuity with Lenin, to undermine Stalin. His suspicion and persecution of communists, right? So I'm not talking about repression in general, talking about repressions about communists. His persecution of ethnic minorities during the Second World War, so particularly in Crimean Tatars, Chechens, things which still have a reverberation now in contemporary politics. And his role in the Second World War, of course, very important for Khrushchev to undermine Stalin as the great war leader, right? And also post-war purges of leadership. The big Leningrad affair with about 200 top-level people associated with Leningrad leadership were again executed, and the relations with Yugoslavia. So basically you have this a shock to the system that Stalin was not ideal, right? And there was Khrushchev kind of tried to roll back and say, like, there are lots of good things he did, like collectivization, for example, 5-year plan. But, basically you have the split introduced by Khrushchev, which is still there in Russia today, about attitudes to Stalin. Is Stalin basically evil, or whether he actually had a very kind of positive, something positive about him as well. So yeah, so that was a very important period where you have again a replacement of collective leadership between 53 to 57 with Khrushchev's more kind of sole leadership, which went for about 7 years, and then you have again collective leadership again, which ended pretty soon as well once Khrushchev was removed.
When we come to the period of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you have the Berlin Wall comes down, all of these former Soviet states sort of come away from communism, and Russia really loses its status as a world superpower. With someone as a strongman like Stalin in the sort of collective memory, what was the view of him as Russia was becoming less and less of a world power?
Yes, very good question, because essentially what you have after attack, a very kind of strong anti-Stalinist campaign under Khrushchev, particularly after 61, when you have Solzhenitsyn published his famous One Day in Life, One Day Research and so forth, the criticism of Stalin died down. It wasn't officially repudiated, but basically they decided not to talk in the Soviet Union about negative aspects of Stalinism anymore. And kind of revive him kind of as a kind of a war leader, so you see him reappearing in films and so forth in a positive light, right, as a kind of the Sarge leader. Now, when the Gorbachev became to power and they began perestroika and glasnost, all those suppressed memories, anti-Soviet suppressed memories, began to resurface again. And you have extreme anti-Stalinist discourse formed in Russia, which basically went way beyond what Khrushchev was trying to do, right? Sort of really talking about, you have an organization called Memorial been formed to look at the victims of Stalin's repression, preserve their memory and so forth, right? And they just been closed down earlier this year by new Russian authorities, for example. But so you have very kind of negative attitudes to Stalin with the perestroika. Basically kind of everything's wrong with the Soviet system was because of Stalin and so forth, and Lenin by extension as well. In the 1990s, you have, of course, diversity of opinion because you have Communist Party still winning quite a substantial number of votes in new Russia in parliamentary elections. We were relatively free in the 1990s. So they're winning between 20 and 25% of the vote. For them, Stalin, and that's very interesting. It wasn't Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, but Stalin, who became the main kind of hero for the Communist Party, right? And also, Communist Party started to drift towards more kind of nationalist form of kind of identity. But you still have this kind of very strong anti-Stalinist impetus within Soviet society. So you still have this kind of Khrushchevian dilemma how to deal with Stalin, but now those things been taken over, and there are parties and political movements and individuals openly writing and discussing those things. Yeah, so you have a pro-Stalin camp, anti-Stalin camp, and Yeltsin, Russian president in the 1990s, he was very, very much anti-Stalin, right? So he was very kind of associating himself with, because communists were his main opponents, first of all, right? He came to power on kind of destroying the Soviet Union, right? Sort of getting rid of Gorbachev, getting rid of the Communist Party, and proclaiming Russian independence in 1991, right? So for Yeltsin, of course, he presented himself as anti-communist. Now, why and I think that's important to remember that what the appeal of Stalin was, rather than kind of as a communist, even to the 1990s communist, and it was because he was a great leader, right? A great leader, what they mean by this is a great power leader, somebody who can put order, so you have mass privatization, corruption, recurs like under Stalin, they all would be be shot, right? Somebody with a strong hand, well, that's what we need. Similar issue with Stalin, of course, is that he was a great world power, right? And looking at Yeltsin, what he's taking all these loans and things from Americans. This would never happen under Stalin, sort of thing. Yeah. So very kind of important reference point for substantial, not majority, but a substantial group of population within Russia as a kind of its alternative to all these very dramatic and for majority of people quite painful reforms which Russia were undergoing in the 1990s.
The centenary of the Russian Revolution took place several years ago in Putin's Russia. Can we talk a bit about how that was commemorated under Putin? And then today, when you have, what's going on, the standoff with Ukraine, it's spreading, towards the coast of Ireland, the coast of Britain. Everybody's looking at that at this at the moment. How does Stalin, the memory of Stalin, feature in Putin's Russia?
Well, first of all, the centenary of Russian Revolution, how it was commemorated, and I think the short answer is that it wasn't, right? That so far as Putin is concerned, there's nothing to celebrate, right? Because it's destroyed Russian Empire, right? There are various ways of Russian kind of identity and within Russian nationalism, you have different types. So you have kind of ethnic type or ethnic nationalism, Russia for the Russians, right? Kind of the ethnic Russians, it's not what Putin is about, right? He's more about great power nationalism, right? So emphasis is on the state. So it doesn't matter what your nationality, as long as you kind of work for the Russian state. Of course, the Russians are always at the core of it, but basically what we're concerned about is that Russia should be a great power. Yeah. And in that way, kind of Stalin plays in quite nicely with it. Yeah. So that's issue of race, which he often attributed to Churchill, although actually it was one of the Isaac Deutscher, one of the historians of early biographer of Stalin, British historian, said that Stalin took over Russia, which had a wooden plow, and left it with an atom bomb, right? So he took one agrarian country, and when he died, it was a superpower, a nuclear superpower, right? So this is the core of the appeal of Stalin in today's Russia, right? It's a great power nationalist. That's why they don't like emphasis on the destruction of the state, the great power nationalism, because the Bolsheviks destroyed the old state, right? But they recreated it later on in different guise in the Soviet Union. So a very kind of difficult kind of historical dilemmas there, how to present it. But what I would like to say is that essentially, so far as the Russian authorities are concerned, and possibly kind of population as well, a majority, though obviously not everybody, this Putin's phrase that Russia had its quota of revolutions. We had enough. We don't need more revolutions, right? So you had two revolutions in 1917, February, October. You have collapse of the Soviet Union, another revolution in 1991. So basically the idea here is that we move away from the post-revolutionary period. We want to emphasize continuity, right? That's why they want to emphasize continuity between the Tsarist state and the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia, right? So often in the West, things are kind of compared. Putin wants to recreate Soviet Union, that he kind of wants to be another Stalin and so forth. Things are much more complicated than that. I think Putin understands that Soviet Union is impossible to recreate for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, he also sees that there are Russian national interests which would lead to some form of not direct political unification within the single state and so forth, but some kind of control and influence over its immediate neighborhood, as well as, of course, the issue of relations with NATO and so forth. So I think that's kind of issue that's this idea of kind of continuity, idea of kind of Russian great power, and great power, of course, it was also in the 19th century, but superpower issue became established under Stalin. Those legacies that Russia sees itself as a natural great power are very kind of strongly entrenched in Russian elite, and I would say Russian population more broadly as well. One thing I would like to say is that again, attitudes to Stalin are very complex in Russia, because you still have a very strong anti-Stalinist group, particularly among the intelligentsia, who are very vocal, who are very influential, because they are the educated classes. There's a lot of influence in terms of disproportion maybe to the kind of numerical size. And Putin acknowledges them, and if you look at his rhetoric, it's very instrumental. He on a 31st of October, commemoration date of victims of political repressions, he always makes the right speech. He always condemns, repressions, and they say like never again and so forth. On other occasions, he could, if you're talking to audiences which are more, grace and money, that say, Stalin was justified in signing that pact as well. So very kind of instrumental attitudes towards Stalin. But again, emphasis is on the continuity and the great power nature of a Russian state, which in 20th century is very strongly influenced by Stalin himself.
Alex, that's our time up. I really do appreciate it, because I know from following you on social media, you're quite in demand with what things are going on at the minute. So I really do appreciate, and I'm not going to go in and ask you how things will play out at the present, because we could be here be here all night. But I really do appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about this, because to be honest, it's not something that I'm overly familiar with, and it has filled in a few blanks for me. So thank you very much.
Well, it's always been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Right.